When we talked about the material we were going to use, and I thought about putting a colour up there and what sort of materials we're going, given the space, given the walls, given the exposure to the wall and all the other things. The colour palette that I ended up going with, for example, was trying to lean on something that wouldn't put that wall and make it even heavier. So effectively doubling up what the white wall was doing, but putting something up there that is in tune with the rest of the hotel, but also in tune with, I think, a more long-term colour palette, so that we're not getting a colour up there that in 2 years we're going to disagree with how we feel about the space and all the things, but something that sits solidly, but at the same time is not disturbing to the space or in any way intimidating. So I chose blue, which is a colour that I'm particularly fond of, but it's a very deep, I guess from my perspective, call it profound blue. It's a very dark blue, and I went through a series of testings with materials and which colours blues, and I ended up with a blue that I've used quite a lot before, which is actually a poster paint, which comes out extremely matte. It's very dense in pigment. It's very solid colour. It's very opaque, so there's almost no tonal change in the colour at all. But what it does, as opposed to most house paints and other paints, is that it absorbs the light rather than give it off. So when light goes onto the colour, it's almost as if the colour disappears into the light disappears into the colour. So you get this very matte blue dark space that sort of sits and hovers within those tones above the paper or the surface. And I'm hoping that that will develop over time into something that becomes sort of a pattern on its own. The technique of transferring, I actually very deliberately chose to make it a very traditional approach, which is really the old kind of overhead projector, projecting it onto a wall, scaling it up and then transferring it onto the paper and then making a carbon copy onto the wall, because it's a very stable and safe process. You can't really make a lot of mistakes in it if you set up the system correctly. And so what I did was I made a grid on the original drawing, and I worked on an AI file on the computer, which is scalable to whatever scale you want to do it, so I knew it would work on the projector. But invariably when you then set up the system and you put your panels up, there's these other things that come into process. So I thinking I could set up a wall within a day, ended up spending 3 or 4 days down there working at night trying to set up the actual horizontals and verticals of the lines and getting those lines to actually match up with a sheet of paper that was going to fit here, and then getting that to work. And so it was, the strangest part for me has actually been working the proximity within transferring. You're literally 3 feet from the paper, and I had to trust myself that those marks that I did originally on a small sheet were going to be exactly as I transferred them up. So that when I put them on this wall, it was the first time I'd actually seen them on the large scale. And when you see them up close, it's basically a line like this in front of your face, and then you go down to the foyer and it's a boat, or it's a window from a house. And that's been the biggest challenge, is to have that perspective of not being able to walk away from. And my mind really boggles as to how Michelangelo did it in 3 feet off a wall in a Sistine Chapel, which is so enormous. It's amazing. With no projectors.
And now you're going to go through that again with the extension of it, after deciding that once you put the stencil up that we needed to extend it out and fill in some more space.
Yeah, and that was interesting, because suddenly I'm working from having been onto the digital image, going on to the transfer and using the transfer and having a lot of trust in the transfer and finding that worked, and therefore feeling very comfortable, to suddenly having to go out and again work really by my instinct. But because I'm on a scissor lift, I basically go up, draw a line, go back down, run across the foyer, have a look, then run back to the scissor lift, go up and put another line. And that's proven quite challenging yesterday. Engaging distances, because the distances aren't the same. Suddenly, 2 centimetres on the computer screen is ½ a metre. So the objects I was looking at from the ground, when I got up on the scissor lift, weren't exactly where I thought they were. They're sort of another 3 feet across.